Well, hello everyone. I'm excited for us to talk to you today about still missing too much school. Me and my partner, Lenay Dunn, we want to make sure that we introduce ourselves and really have a good conversation as we talk through this important topic. My name is Paul Perrault. I am Senior Vice President of Community Impact and Learning at the Helios Education Foundation. But more importantly for this group, I am a Flinn-Brown Fellow from 2016. Lenay?
Great. Thanks, Paul. Hi, I'm Lenay Dunn. I am a Senior Research Director at WestEd, and I am a 2017 Flinn-Brown Fellow. So very happy to join a fellow Flinn-Brown Fellow to share some of this information with you today.
Right. As we kick off this work, we really kind of wanted to start with a polling question for all of you. We're going to be talking about chronic absenteeism, but we thought it would be really interesting to get everyone's thoughts that are on the webinar about what they think about chronic absenteeism. So we're going to ask you this question that's going to pop up right now. How would you characterize the issue of chronic absence in Arizona? And we're going to ask you to do one choice, one being not concerning, 2 concerning, 3 urgent, and 4 a crisis level. So we'll ask everyone to just kind of take a few seconds and choose one of those answers. Give us about 10 more seconds. Okay, can we see the results of the poll? So it looks like if we look across this, about 55% of the people that are on the webinar today think it's an urgent problem, or another 20% crisis level. So 75% thinking it's very important or urgent or crisis level. And I would have to say Lenay and I would probably agree with that, that we think that chronic absenteeism is a major issue and it really has led to some of this work that we're going to talk about today. If we can go to the next slide.
And while we're doing that, Paul, just mention that the Q&A, if you have any questions, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A.
Thank you. As you know, get a little background on this. So, about 5.5 years ago, right before the pandemic, Helios and WestEd started having conversations about chronic absenteeism. We were interested in seeing what was happening with chronic absenteeism, how it was impacting student outcomes like math and English, how it was impacting, different student groupings, and especially when we think about like those students that are on free and reduced lunch, and those migratory students that are more migrant students moving from place to place. And so we had this idea of looking at this study, and then the pandemic hit. And so we did an initial first wave of chronic absenteeism, looking at 3 years prior to the pandemic, then the year of the pandemic of 2020 into 2021. And today, what you're going to see is us following up, around what was happening after the pandemic. And it's important because a lot of people, probably us included, thought, chronic absenteeism really was going to, increase during, COVID, but then it was going to stabilize after we started having more students go back to schools. And, we're going to be a little spoiler alert right now, and I think many of you know that already by your answers on the poll, but, chronic absenteeism overall has continued to increase, except for this last year where we're seeing it more stabilizing, starting to come down. But it has not gone back to those pre-pandemic levels, meaning that a lot more students are missing school 5 years out after the pandemic than they were before. And that's a challenge for many reasons, many reasons that if students start doing poorly, they can get disengaged. If they start getting disengaged, they do poorly in the next year and they even miss more school. And ultimately, that can lead to students either dropping out of school, failing out of school, or if they do graduate, not being prepared for the workforce or being prepared for college. And so that's why, it's really important as we look into these chronic absenteeism issues. So as we start out, and we think about this study, the year that we're really looked at is this last year is 2022 and 23. And we did that specifically because that is the year we can really look at where the data connects to outcomes such as, again, math, reading, and how students that were chronically absent did in those kind of core educational areas. And one of the biggest things that we found is that nearly 1 of 3 students in Arizona in grades K through 8, or in grades 1 through 8, were chronically absent in that year. Now, when we look at this, the chart on the right kind of shows 2 different things. One is the current definition, and that's the solid bar line. The current definition is being chronically absent means missing 18 or more days of school in the same school. So, for example, if you started, in Phoenix Union and you missed 19 days, you're going to be chronically absent in Phoenix Union. We look at an alternative definition, and in fact, we're trying to work with, key policy leaders to change that definition to look at absences across schools. That means that if you started in Phoenix Union and you missed 10 days of school, and then you moved to Mesa and you missed another 10 days of school, you would be chronically absent. Under the current definition, if you missed 10 and 10, you wouldn't be. And so we really think it's important, number one, to understand how many kids are just missing 18 or more days across schools, not in just one individual schools. And so the line there, really does show, from 2016 and 17 all the way to 2022 to 23, those students that were chronically absent, solid bar, meaning those students that were missed 18 or more days in one school, and the dotted line, those students that missed 18 or more days across schools. And why it looks like it's a percentage different, only 1%, we're talking about basically 1 million kids in Arizona. So 1% can actually be a pretty high number. So what we see is while this represents a slight decline from the peak of the 21-22 year, it remains more than double the pre-pandemic rates. And you can really see that if you look at those 3 years before the pandemic. Obviously, it dips down and gets lower during that pandemic year, and that's because students went home and they weren't measuring absences anymore. And it's really important as we think about that, it is understanding what that definition of chronic absenteeism is, why we need to understand, what that means for students that are moving more so that we can understand the full nature of the problem. Next slide, please. So one of the things as we walk through this, we wanted to highlight what developed out of that first report in working with our partners on Read On was an Arizona task force that really focused on chronic absenteeism and the issues that it was having on students. And so as we look at this data, we want to kind of connect it with some of the recommendations from that task force, which Lenay was a part of, and a number of other educational leaders across the state. So one of the most important things is we wanted to collect actionable data to identify challenges and drive solutions. Until we really started digging into this data, the data wasn't really shared in a way that was easily identifiable for people to understand the nature of the problem. In fact, the way that we're presenting this data today is really a statewide picture. Where we don't present the data unless we're working with specific schools and districts. We don't present it individually, but we can share that data now, and so can the department. But when we were first starting looking at this, it would be hard for you to be able to identify those kinds of things. So task force number one, making sure that data was being collected and used in a way that's important. And then two, kind of what I talked about a little bit in that earlier slide, revisit that chronic absenteeism definition. How can we be consistent so it's those students that are missing 18 days or more across schools? And because of that, where we are now, we would say Arizona slightly undercounts chronic absenteeism by defining it as missing that 10% or more. Next slide. So the gaps and why we really want to understand what's going on is because, one of the things that we're going to show you and be able to show is that, there are a number of different groupings that we could look at. English language learners, free and reduced lunch learners. We could look by gender. We could look by race and ethnicity. We could look by students with special needs and that. And what we wanted to identify is, were we seeing bigger gaps in those students taking place after COVID, meaning that, you know, when we were trying to close gaps in how students were doing in math and English and other kind of subjects, you know, were we seeing those gaps that now starting to widen because there was differentiation in how kids were missing school. So one of the things we can say, the gaps in chronic absentee rates between vulnerable student populations and other students that increased during the pandemic have not continued to widen. So that's really good for us right now. But what we do see is that there still is still considerable gaps that were not present before the pandemic that we're starting to see now. Next slide. So this is a good way for us to start looking at you know, chronic absenteeism rates too. So a little explanation on how to read these graphics. So on the one hand side, the left hand side, you know, right now this slide is looking at those students that are who are on free and reduced lunch status. So we're going to call them economically disadvantaged students compared to kids that are not on free and reduced lunch status. So on the left-hand side, those are the not economically disadvantaged students. The right-hand side of the graphic is those students that are on free and reduced lunch. We have 3 comparison years here. The orange is the pre-pandemic cohort, so they started, you know, before the pandemic. The light blue is the pandemic cohort, so they really were in 5th grade, you know, during the pandemic and then continued on. And then the 20 to 21 is the darker blue, and that's the post-pandemic cohort. And so each of those bars are looking from what happens from 5th grade to 7th grade. And pretty much, as you can see, is that all of those bars increased, but those bars on the left-hand side, you know, have a much smaller slope. And meaning that, you know, those students that are not free and reduced lunch status are actually chronically absent a lot less. And we can see even, you know, the biggest one during that pandemic cohort went all the way from, you know, 15 to, you know, in the 35 percentiles. You know, even those students in the post-pandemic that are not free and reduced lunch, the highest it got up is 23%. So, you know, right there, we're seeing a strong correlation between those students that are economically disadvantaged and chronically absenteeism. Next slide. We can also look at that same kind of slide by race and ethnicity. And, you know, one of the things that we like to, or we will point out, is that chronic absenteeism was a challenge for some students more so before the pandemic even than other students. Native Americans, for example, when we look even at that pre-pandemic, you know, we had higher rates for Native American students in Arizona for being chronically absent than we did, you know, even after or even before the pandemic than most other students. So this kind of graphic now kind of breaks it down by, you know, the 5 different racial ethnic groups that we're looking at here: American Indians, Asian, Black African American, Hispanic or Latino, and white. And one of the things that, you know, we would point out here is I like to kind of show that comparison between Black students, Hispanic students, and white students. That pre-pandemic cohort that started, you know, in 2016 and 17, almost all of those groupings were right around the same percentage, you know, anywhere from 9, 10, or 11 in that. And then they increased, you know, to 13 to 18. But one of the things that we started seeing is when the pandemic hit is that especially for Hispanic and Black students, those percentages in that slope increased at a much higher rate, much faster rate. And over time, you know, while they've all gone down a little bit, what we really have seen is that Black students and Hispanic students are continuing to miss school at much higher rates than white students after the pandemic. And so why that gets challenging is, again, we don't want to see like academic outcomes, you know, change between those groupings, and you start getting worried that if students are missing, you know, 18 or more days of school, that we're going to start seeing that there's going to be academic issues between those groupings as well. And that's one of the things that we really wanted to do in this next set of analyses that Lenay is going to talk about is how can we really understand, you know, how chronic absenteeism is connected or related to student outcomes. With that, Lenay, why don't I hand it off to you and we could talk about the next section of the analysis.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. So one of the things that we wanted to keep connecting this to is that task force that Paul mentioned. So the statewide task force, with these key recommendations. And one of the recommendations that we had in the task force was to really prioritize data collection. So really thinking about that data being actionable and looking at different student groups, really tracking that, really to be preventative, so that you're identifying what those attendance trends look like early in the school year, and that districts and schools have that kind of data readily accessible so that they can provide supports, interventions, and whatever's needed for students early on. So that really wanted to relate it to that task force recommendation, because though we've seen those gaps are not continuing to widen, there's still a lot of work left to do. Okay, in the next slide, we're going to show you that analysis that we did in looking at the relationship between English language arts proficiency as measured by the statewide exam that students take at different grade levels, and the chronic absence. So to do this, we zeroed in because we did a statewide analysis. So we looked at student level data of students all across the state from first grade to eighth grade, which is a really large population of students. So to really narrow in and understand what's happening in trends, we looked at these crucial grades of fifth grade and seventh grade. And those are that transition point, right? As you enter middle school and as you're, moving through middle school. So there was a relationship, both before the pandemic, which is the orange line, the pandemic cohort who started fifth grade in 2018, 2019, and the post-pandemic cohort that started fifth grade in 2020, 2021. So those that are proficient in ELA in fifth grade are on the left side, and you can see the slope of that relationship between the proficiency and the chronic absence is a smaller slope than the groupings on the right side, which are students that were not ELA proficient in fifth grade. So those students both started fifth grade with higher chronic absence rates and ended seventh grade with higher chronic absence rates than students who were proficient in English language arts. And you can understand that this is a correlation. So we don't, there's not a causal relationship here, but it describes that important relationship that we know well established in the research that Paul talked about as well, that if you're not at school, you're not going to be able to get the content. And so that just compounds over time. The more you're missing school, the more you're missing content. The more you're missing content, perhaps the less motivated you might be to come to school because you're falling behind. So we can really see that relationship represented here, and how quickly that slope was increasing during the pandemic for students, that light blue line. This relationship is also demonstrated on the next slide with math. And it's the same analysis that we're looking at. So the orange line are the pre-pandemic cohort who entered fifth grade in 2016-17. The light blue is 2018-19, which is the pandemic cohort. And then the 2020-2021 post-pandemic cohort. So the same kind of relationship here, that we see these students who were not proficient in math, which is on the right side. Not only were they starting with higher levels of chronic absence, but that chronic absence was increasing. Now you'll notice that post-pandemic cohort of students, that rate isn't increasing anymore. So that, they kind of hit a ceiling, and then it is starting to decrease. But then the math proficient students, there's such a difference and such a lower rate of chronic absence for the students who were proficient in math at fifth grade. So that relationship is really important to understand as we think about how do you help and support students who are chronically absent. Those needs continue to compound and continue to create more challenges for students. So in addition to looking at these data, so Paul and I and our teams at West Ed and Helios have been collaborating to look at chronic absence at several points in time, and we're doing this because we really want to help people be able to know the patterns, know the issues, and then zero in on some evidence-based strategies to address them. So we wanted to highlight a couple of things in the Missing Too Much School brief that we recently released back in January that shows a couple of districts and what they're doing to address this issue, because recognizing that idea that if students aren't in school, they're not going to be able to learn content and how important it is to get students there. So on the next slide, we highlight the Murphy Elementary School District. And I just wanted to point out that before the pandemic, 21% of students district-wide were considered chronically absent, but that spiked to 62%. And then as students returned to in-person learning in 21-22, and now it's down to about a third of students. So they're making some progress, and they're really hopeful and confident about the pattern and the direction they're going. So here are a few key things that they've done. So they've really engaged with parents to communicate and provide support. Even transportation can often be an issue for getting kids to school. So providing transportation options for families and really talking to parents about how important that consistent attendance is. And I think some of that messaging was difficult, during the pandemic. There were a lot of guidelines about when students could come to school or could not, and those guidelines have changed. So being clear about that communication, about when students need to be home for illness and when students need to be at school. So that communication is key. Sometimes there are barriers to students coming to school, which could include, factors that are really not in the school's purview or control, but the school wants to support. So if students don't have appropriate clothing to come to school, then having some uniforms to help students have the clothing that they need to be at school was one action that school district took. This is a district that's in the Phoenix area. And I think also there's a lot of research about the importance of celebrating the attendance milestones. So when you're achieving those milestones, making this a community effort to say, we're committed to having students come to school, and we're celebrating when students are hitting those milestones and coming to school. And really approaching it as a preventative issue. So intervening early to identify students at risk of chronic absence and addressing that before it escalates to the issue, to the level of chronic absence. So making that celebration and that community of expectation around attendance can be really crucial. Also, just this kind of goes back to the idea of communication. Having technology can support that communication. And there are a lot of great studies about the power of text messaging for parents and caregivers and other ways of communication to really help support and build that community ownership around attendance. And also addressing all students' needs holistically. So sometimes there might be mental health supports that are needed, or there might be other kinds of supports. There's after school enrichments, all the kinds of supports that are needed to address students holistically. There's really good evidence around that providing additional support can support students in wanting to come to school and then being successful once they come to school. We also want to highlight another district that's also noted in the brief, which is the Alhambra Elementary School District, which is also in the Phoenix area. And they had about 62% of their students were chronically absent in 2021-2022, and that dropped to 43% in 23-24. And again, there's a lot of what they're trying to do to continue to move that downward, right? We want to have those levels as low as we can. But that's a really great improvement. And how they did that was really having supports and strategic community partnerships. So we want to talk about some of the supports that they built. So they had attendance improvement teams. So it was, again, that culture of individualized attention and support, and using data through those teams to identify students who might need some additional support early on. Similar to the other district that we talked about, basic needs support. So food, hygiene, clothes, connecting families to resources and resource centers where their needs could be met. That might be a barrier to getting kids to school. Engaging with parents in a really kind of a way that was a two-way dialogue to really understand for each family what the barriers are. There's a lot of information about consistent issues that that can contribute to chronic absence, but it's really a specific issue for different families, and understanding in your community what the root causes of chronic absence are and how to support individual families is something that they did some collaboration. I know Valley of the Sun United Way and others have worked really closely with communities to help identify those root causes and really approach it from individualized family supports. And those community partnerships that they had, like with the Valley of the Sun United Way and the National Coalition for Improvement in Education, really helped bolster Alhambra's supports to address chronic absence in their community. So those are just a couple of the districts that are highlighted in the brief that we had. We're going to share a resource in just a moment from the task force that also shares some additional stories, because I think it's important to see what does this look like in action for districts. So in the next slide, we have just some implications and next steps as you all think about from your perspective and your work. So what can you do, right? I mean, in the beginning, 75% of you who are here said we're at a level where this is an urgent concern or a crisis. We looked at the data across the state where it showed we have, a third of our students nearly missing school, chronically absent, missing school, and the relationship that that has on later outcomes for academics and for the hitting the milestones, third grade reading, graduation, all of those key pieces. We know how important this is. So what do we need to do? Well, as a community, really building some awareness. So there's a statewide call to action through that chronic absence task force that says we need to address chronic absence as a community and really promote regular school attendance. So what, from your perspective, I know we have people on here who are, doctors who work in the health field. We have people who work in social services. There's so many different perspectives. And you think about the charge of Flinn-Brown, right, where we're thinking across sectors. How do we address these major problems or issues in our state from a collaborative and cross-sector way? From your vantage point, where can you contribute to building awareness about the importance of regular school attendance? And the resource guide that's linked here, the chronic absence resource guide that's from the task force, has some really great ways to suggest how to join that statewide call to action. Also, engaging in data-driven decision making. So schools need actionable data to identify patterns, to be able to identify students early on who might need support, and then also kind of address that root cause of attendance issues in their local community. So there will be different reasons for chronic absence in different communities, and digging in to identify the root causes and understand what might be contributing to that is really important, so that decisions are being made with data and being made to fit the local context. As Paul mentioned, this idea that identifying students who are moving between different schools throughout the year, it's really important, not only because it's just undercounting overall chronic absence by about 1% statewide, but when you drill that down to individual students and individual districts and schools, those are students who are going to need supports and who are not probably being identified to need that support early on. So updating that definition and the accountability metrics, and also just the actionable data around that to make sure that students are being identified that are moving schools, so that they're getting the supports that they need to have regular school attendance. And then finally, supporting the use of evidence-based strategies. So prevention strategies, we've talked a lot about some of those prevention strategies. There are also a lot of evidence-based intervention strategies. So how do you support students once they're already on that track for chronic absence? We want to ensure that the strategies that are being used are evidence-based and fit the local context and needs, but also that once you're implementing, and once a district or school is implementing an evidence-based strategy, that it's really being examined to say, is it working in our context? So providing the supports that's needed to be able to look at those evidence-based strategies, to engage those evidence-based strategies, and then say, are they working? And if they're not, identifying other evidence-based strategies that will better fit the need and better make the progress that's needed to address this ongoing urgent issue. And then also, we just would say part of what you can do if you're not in education, review and share the Arizona, or if you are and you haven't seen this yet, review and share the Arizona Chronic Absence Resource Guide. It has a framework of evidence-based strategies that you can look at, you can understand. There's rankings about based on the evidence level. There's a wealth of information there about how to select evidence-based strategies that are going to support your goals in your community. So if you're coming from outside of education, how can you support that in the work that you do? So I think we wanted to just take a minute to open it up to questions. I know we had one previous question that came through the Q&A. And Paul, that question was asking, are these trends consistent nationwide, or is Arizona an outlier? And so we were talking about, at one point Arizona had one of the highest rates in the nation. That's leveled out a bit now. But there's a couple of great resources where you can look at the statewide trends across different states. I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would say that, especially at Helios, we're usually looking at Arizona and Florida, and Florida is another state that leads. But chronic absenteeism is not a one state issue. It really is a national issue that we're seeing across the country. Now, some states have had more success in narrowing it down, but it's definitely an issue that has continued to be a problem across the country.
Absolutely. And I think to that too, I know that there's work that WestEd we've been doing in California and Nevada to address chronic absence and, to really dig in. And I think a lot of that has been done at the district level, because sometimes statewide, it's really when you're looking across the state, it's to see the trend, and from, statewide agencies and supports can bring that call to action and bring that urgency and awareness. And a lot of the work is really happening at the district level. And so what are districts, engaging with? What data are they looking at? And then, helping them find those evidence-based strategies and look at them closely.
We had another question pop up, Lenay. So, and this is from Jennifer. Yesterday, Superintendent Horn had a press conference to announce that the law enforcement will be supporting his officers' efforts to address truancy. Sheriff Sheridan mentioned writing citations for parents whose children are missing school. Is a punitive response considered best practice? I'll take a first crack at that, Lenay, and then ask you to join in too. Almost all of the research, or really much all of the research, really shows that positive reinforcements, building relationships with parents, those kind of interventions and opportunities that have a kind of a carrot or an incentive lead to better results. And oftentimes we can see in some of the research that punitive actually can lead to students missing more school, or people then starting to have like fines or different things that cause other issues. And so, we will say that, the way that we're looking at this is, number one, we want people to use data to understand that there's a problem, because oftentimes parents sometimes will forget how many absences their kids have had, especially as you're going throughout a year. And so early intervention, letting hey, your students missed 2 or 3 days, they're on track to be chronically absent, is an important thing. And then number two, building that trust in those relationships and building opportunities with those incentives, those are going to be the best practices that we can say that the research has showed results. Lenay, anything to add there?
I don't have anything to add. I do appreciate that there is such a focus on chronic absence statewide, that everyone is taking this issue really seriously. And I think people are trying to identify the best solutions. And I think that's it kind of relates to the next question, where it's saying, are there information about causes for the increase in chronic absence, more extended vacations, more time home for sickness, more time away caring for parents? And I think that's where it really depends on the community. And that's where I think the idea of local communities identifying what their root causes are, because in some communities it might be extended vacations, but that may not be the issue in another community. So really drilling into, there's some great resources around root cause analyses and being able to look at different root causes of chronic absence and identify that for your community, and then finding those evidence-based strategies and best practices that connect to those specific issues is always a great way to address it.
Right. And, and I will say that, one of the things that we like to talk about a lot is that there isn't one silver bullet. So finding one root cause that you focus your attention on, that's going to be a little bit problematic because, students miss for, during the pandemic, a number of students were missing because they might actually have to be babysitters for, siblings. They might have actually had to help, have jobs and support their family. Transportation issues were bigger during the pandemic too. And so that's one of the things is that's why it's so important to find out and have those family connections is because there's multiple reasons why students are missing school. And so we have to have those connections. Next question, Lenay, is there a higher rate of chronic absenteeism in rural or urban schools, or is it consistent across the state?
Yeah. Well, this report that we released, the brief, does not have that um, noted or identified, but we have engaged in additional research where we're looking at student and school characteristics that are related to chronic absence. And the school characteristics, it some of it is more related to free and reduced price lunch. I'm just looking at the urbanicity. That really hasn't been one of the issues in terms of a town or rural suburb or city. Though the rates are, they're pretty much around the same actually for most students, at least in that zeroed in cohort where we looked at the fifth grade, that middle school. It really doesn't make much of a difference for individual student probabilities of being absent. That school characteristic does not. It's really a statewide issue. It's really an issue in every community, urban, rural, suburban, and the reasons for it and the ways to address it really do have to be community grounded, even though it is a statewide issue.
And Danielle, maybe we can we stop sharing the deck? That was one of the kind of questions or suggestions. So that people could see us better. And I will say, even looking at that, now it's on Arizona, we did look at some of that in Florida as well, and rural schools did have a little bit higher chronic absenteeism. And even we know with the Native American population, some of the tribal schools, which are going to be more rural, they're going to have higher numbers as well too. So but then I can tell you at the same time, when we break it down in the regions or other kinds of things, we can see that urban schools you can have quite high chronic absenteeism as well. And that's, and finding these solutions is never easy. I mean, like we've been doing this kind of work as we've been looking at the analysis. We also are building surveys and protocols for families, for students, for administrators to understand what's that root cause and trying to get that. But, right now our message has just been is, like when we think about how students are doing academically, if you're not in school, it's hard to really do well. And that's the message we're trying to really kind of continue to put out there. So, and what does that lead to? Again, back to that disengagement in school, back to students dropping out. Where does that leave you, down the road when you're looking for opportunities to, enter a workforce or a certificate or college and all that? That's where, we are connecting all of that chronic absenteeism to long-term impacts it's going to have on students' lives.
Right.
Um, Jeannie, you put a really good question on there, and you talk about at higher ground success with individualized family supports, and that most districts don't have the staff to be effective. Um, you know, I don't know if I would necessarily say that exactly the same way. I think it's, how can you help train some of the staff so that they can use their time wisely? And that's what some of these districts have been. They've created some of these school teams like Lenay talked about, so that they can look at data, they can reach out to students, they can put in, opportunities to, send a quick letter home that, a student has missed a couple days, so that's early identification. But that is going to be a challenge. If schools are more limited in that, then it's going to take other opportunities within a community or community organizations to help schools be able to do some of that work.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so there was a district we were working with in Nevada that was doing a very individualized intervention to support students. So it was it's something every day that was a touch point with an adult at school. And adult at the school had to be trained in this, and just having enough people that had the time in the day to be able to deliver the intervention was a real challenge. And those are the kinds of realities. And I think, again, that gets back to what are the evidence-based strategies that will fit your context. And in the resource guide, the Arizona Chronic Absence Task Force Resource Guide, there's a tool that actually my team and I at WestEd developed around identifying chronic absence interventions, but then assessing their fit for the local context with questions like capacity and cost and the kinds of things that, like, to make it successful, because it can be an evidence-based strategy, but that doesn't mean you're going to get the results that you know are possible if you don't have the conditions set up for it. And staffing is a huge consideration. So if you don't have the staffing capacity to deliver something like that, that might not be the right fit, evidence-based strategy fit for your community.
Yeah. One good question Cumulate asks is, does it appear parents are aware of the absenteeism and the impact? Are parents an opportunity area as well? Lenay, do you want to take a first crack at that one?
Sure. I mean, I think it varies, how aware parents are of this issue, right? And again, that inconsistent messaging, because even personally as a parent, I think during the pandemic, there were a set of guidelines that are different now, and understanding why is it so important for your student to show up, for your child to show up at school. That is a message that can be really powerful when it's taken up from the community. And I think there are countless stories about districts being able to take that along with community partners and everyone making that, attendance really matters. Attendance is important, and having that, posted in, there was a small rural community in California that we worked with a few years ago, and they were posting signs all around restaurants in this small community about the importance of being in school. So it was everyone having that. And so making people more aware of that, I think, is definitely an opportunity. And I think that's where that statewide call to action, that we all can be ambassadors for talking about the importance of attendance. It's something that everyone should be able to talk about from whatever your vantage point is, and why is it important to be there in school. So yes, definitely an opportunity, and there's always more work to be done in it. So I really appreciate that question.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, and I'll go a different route on that, in that I do agree that it's an opportunity, but I think that, some parents also saw, especially during the pandemic, kids had access to a lot more resources online. So if they missed school, you could do some of the work at home. And kind of like there's debates about remote work, I think that is a segment of parents out there too that feel like, well, if my kid can catch up at home, and they're not really falling behind, they get the assignments in, do they really need to be there? And honestly, they are missing still a lot of instruction, opportunities for questions. And so I do think that parents are a big opportunity for us to talk to, that just because, a student can find their assignment online or even see, some PowerPoint slides of what happened in the lesson, doesn't mean that they're getting the instruction that they actually needed. And that should be a second resort. That shouldn't be a first resort. So definitely more should be happening, with parents and that opportunity as it continues, because as we saw, those students that are missing more school are not doing as well in math and English. Those students that are economically disadvantaged aren't doing as well in chronic absenteeism. We are seeing a big problem. And if we don't start curing that, long term, those are going to turn into even bigger problems. Well, a question that popped up, it's a great question. Does the study address students of color being bullied, harassed, or discriminated against? We are looking, Lenay and I are actually looking deeper into all of the schools, and the data has, reasons for why a student is absent. We haven't analyzed that data to that extent yet. Ours was more just the quantitative study, really, the focus on who's missing school, how much school are they missing, and that too. No doubt that bullying is a problem for some students. And I would say that, we would want to dig into that too. Challenge with that is, oftentimes people aren't going to be honest about, if you're missing school, calling in and saying, well, it's because my son or daughter was bullied. So, understanding that might have to come out through different approaches, surveys, interviews, those types of things, we're probably a little skeptical of what the data around, why a student is missing that the school captures will kind of really give us that data. But that's a great question. No doubt that bullying and those kind of aspects probably do play a role in a certain percentage of students missing school.
I think the question, the grassroots community work. So someone asked, what grassroots community work have you seen be quickly successful? And I think, we've talked about some examples. I think maybe someone from Valley of the Sun United Way might be on this call. They've been very active in the community in helping to address chronic absence in communities in partnership. I think grassroots work, it's really making connections to resources for families. Often, if whatever the particular barriers might be, is it transportation? Is it childcare of younger siblings? Is it access to food or clothing? Are those barriers? What are the particular barriers, and how can communities support it? And then I think just from a community grassroots aspect too, just really coming together on a goal. And I know that the task force resource guide and the task force recommendations, we really talk about that idea that having a statewide goal, focusing on a goal, and really making it something that everyone can really support and understand their role in, can really create that grassroots call to action to say we're all taking collective responsibility to support students being in school.
And one of the other things that we really highlight too is, or would like to highlight is, hey, we're here today for the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership. Being at school helps you learn how to work with other people that might have differing opinions, how to relate as community members, how to be involved in your community. And so that's where chronic absenteeism, as we connect this to the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership, is important, is how does it make us better citizens? How do we interact with those people, again, like we talked about in the community, people that might have differing opinions, but really work for that common goal, of us having stronger communities and better lives. And so I think that's the other important aspect is, if we start missing school or we just hang out in our own cliques or smaller groups, is that really going to work to create better civic opportunities for us?
Great point, Paul.
Wanted to give us any last opportunities for any kind of questions. Eric put up there, he's heard of remind being used for school district to share information with parents. Again, I haven't actually seen that one yet, but any of those opportunities that you can share or get involved with your school districts or community organizations, this is something that we need to address sooner than later, because we're already 5 years across, from where the pandemic peaked this kind of chronic absenteeism. We thought it was going to go down, and it's going down slowly, but very slowly. And you start to wonder how many students are going to be negatively impacted by this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just I hope that as we share some of the resources, and I do encourage you from any perspective, any vantage point, any role that you have in the community, looking at the task force resource guide, because you can support from your role. And as Paul said, as civic leaders, we can engage with this information, we can engage and support. So take an active role in thinking about how you can address it in your own family, in your own community, and then statewide. And we really appreciate the interest in this, because as we know, this is an urgent issue. This is something we have to address as leaders who care about our community. So thank you for being here and sharing your perspectives. And we saw a question, will we be sharing this recording? Yes, the recording and the slides will be shared. And thank you so much for attending today. And we'll hang out if there are any other questions, but otherwise, thank you so much.
Yeah. And also I would only add, you can reach out to Lenay or myself. You can look for Lenay at, on the WestEd website, or myself at the Helios website. Glad to follow up with anyone individually if they have any other questions too.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.